We are on to the arrival of baby. And once again, I'm going to flood you with a bunch of pictures of my kid because I'm obsessed. So for this is after baby is born, and kind of some of the changes that occur, the developmental, both physically, and I think there's cognitive stuff in here as well. So after baby arrives, we talked about how 92 to 95% of all full-term babies are born totally fine, with no birth defects. Most babies are born about full term, and if they're not, we still have like that 26 weeks where they're viable fetus, and they can most likely live on the outside of the womb unaided. So I always keep this slide in because it is from my former psychology teacher when I was in high school. And she was not a mom at the time and always thought babies were really ugly until she had her own. So she always talks about how like newborn babies aren't always the cutest. So maybe don't judge them. So upon birth, you have to realize, and they talk about this in the Science of Babies video, that a baby has to fit out through a rather small opening. And so their head can be pretty misshapen. So some of you, when you're working on your neonate paper tonight, and asking your parents or your family or somebody that knew you when you were an infant about when you were young or your birth story, they might have pictures or reference the fact that you had a cone head. And that's due to the fact that you have to fit out a very small channel, right? The birth canal. And babies have that soft spot in their head so their skull can mold correctly to fit out. So also, it's pretty traumatic, depending on how long the labor is, too. Either way, you're smushing a human through a rather tight area, and they can come out pretty swollen. So my baby is this bottom one down here, and he didn't have the cone head, but he did have some, like, puffy eyes. And a lot of time they'll put stuff on it. But yeah, they're just like, they're pretty puffed up and red and swollen for a while. Because birth is pretty traumatic for both mother and baby, to be honest. So with this, I love this video. It doesn't show it breaking. It's not super grotesque beyond the red coloring here. But it shows baby in an amniotic sac. They do not burst it on this film. I'm sure there's ones that do, but not this one. And so this baby, they got it out of the uterus without popping the sac somehow. Her water never broke. And so this baby really doesn't even know it's been born yet, right? Things are really bright, but otherwise it's fully encased. So that's what a baby looks like in the uterus, in the amniotic sac before birth. So eventually they'll tear that sac and then the baby's born and it'll be like gasping for air and trying to take in that first breath. But it's really cool. The baby has no clue it's actually, well, because it's not been born yet, right? They haven't actually, like, had that baby take its breath. So, when it comes to our brains and motor skills, when we're in the womb, we produce about 250,000 brain cells per minute. We just are rapidly growing them and forming them, which is awesome. But that's pretty much, as far as we know right now, all you're ever going to develop. And then we just kind of weed them out from there, and things we don't use, it goes away. So when we look at these pictures, it's like neural connections. When we're born, we really don't have that many neural connections beyond like what we learned in the womb. Like neural connection for hearing voices and processing sound and recognizing voices as far as like our mom. But right after we are born, we start forming all these connections. When we talk about babies and kids being like little sponges soaking up everything, it's true. They are forming neural connections very, very quickly because they have to learn everything. Everything is new to them. They're trying to understand the world around them in their own unique way. And so we talk about brain plasticity. This is a picture of brain plasticity. Your brain forming new channels, forming new pathways, and learning. What we know is when people talk about, well, how can I make my kid really smart? How can I make them do well in school? How can I make them just bright individuals? Well, we know one thing that helps with fostering neural connections and forming these synapses, or these neural networks, is being read to and being talked to. So let's say you are taking a graduate class or you're in college or whatever, and you're reading this really boring book, or you have an instruction manual for putting together your new oven. I don't know. Even just reading a newborn, whatever you're looking at, is consistent with reading. It doesn't have to be like we're reading Goldilocks and the Three Bears. It can be literally anything you read them. It helps them just learn about language and process that stuff, and it can make them a lot brighter. So also talking to your baby, just sitting there and being able to talk to them will increase their synaptic connections, right? Their neurons are going to talk to each other more because they're trying to process and learn language. That's how we learn language. It's not we sit our kid down with a book and say, okay, here's how to talk. They just are mimicking what they hear and what they see, and that's how they learn fluency. That's how they learn vocab. That's how they learn how to process sound and understand directions, right? All of this. So reading is good, but so is talking, right? Both of those things, keeping your kids in somewhat of a social interaction pattern. But we also have the rubber band theory, which says that, you know, you might have a kid with a rubber band this big and one with a rubber band this big, right? Like that's the genetics. You're born with what you're born with. And so the kid with a rubber band this big, it can still stretch, but it's only going to stretch like maybe this much. The kid with the giant rubber band, it can stretch too, and it's going to stretch this big. So, you know, it's one of those things where if you're born with better genetics or whatever, yeah, you're going to have a leg up on everyone else. But this also says that even if you're born with poor genetics, every person has the ability to expand, to learn, to have more neural connections. It's just every kid's not going to look the same as everyone else. Everyone has the ability to learn to some degree. It just might be at different levels or within a different range of ability. So, healthy newborns, things they do. They turn their head toward voices, especially mom's voice. They prefer mom's voice, but they will turn to voices. They can see only about 8 to 12 inches from their face, and they'll talk about this in the Science of Babies about why it's 8 to 12 inches. But the reason it's that degree is because that's about the distance from face to face of a newborn baby when they're breastfeeding. And so while they're breastfeeding, they can clearly see mom's face because she is within 8 to 12 inches of that, which is super neat because that helps with bonding. They gaze longer at objects that look similar to human faces. So if you gave them both of these pictures to stare at within their 8 to 12 range from their face, they would stare at this one far longer because it resembles the pattern or shape of a human face. They don't really like this one. And we can't ask a baby which one they prefer or which one they're interested in more. So we just have to count how many seconds they stare at something, and the things they stare at longer interest them more. So also they prefer symmetrical objects. So even with faces, we talked about how humans prefer symmetry for attractiveness. And if you took an altered face of someone, the symmetrical version versus their real face, people often will say the symmetrical one's like the prettier twin, right? Well, babies would do the same thing. They like symmetry. So it just seems like inherently we're born with that innate drive to like symmetrical things. We can actually start hearing when we are about 2 to 3 months old in the womb. So when we're in that fetus stage, and we prefer mom's voice to other voices, typically not the same for dad. Touch, necessary development. We talked about it. We prefer sweet over sour and salty things, probably because mom's breast milk has a sweet taste to it. So we prefer that. And also things that are like sour and bitter, evolutionary speaking. Things that are poisonous are usually bitter and sour, so maybe that's why we're kind of are persuaded not to really love those flavors or those tastes, just because in the past, in our evolution, they've meant bad for us. And then smell. Babies prefer sweet things, and they often turn away from things that stink, just like us. If something stinks, we turn our nose up to it, so does a baby. And they usually prefer mom's smell. I know this is not, unless not breastfeeding, but you still have babies when they are like snuggled by mom all the time, they will prefer it. So if you have an infant that's freaking out, and they just are crying a lot, these newborns, one of the things to do is the shirt that mom wore the day before, if you just put it next to them or near them while you're snuggling them or they're laying in their swing, it can calm them down because just the smell of mom is triggering of like them relaxing and being calm and thinking mom's around. And it's because of that bonding that takes place. So we fixate on human faces, we turn to human voices, we prefer music that we usually heard in the womb. There's cases of that where maybe if I listened to the Beatles all the time while I was pregnant, I don't have to put the headphones on my belly, I just had to listen to it, my kid would have heard it. Maybe he has an acclamation for liking the Beatles now or thinking this music's good, just having that preference. So babies do have reflexes upon birth. One is rooting. If you stroke the side of their cheek, they will instinctively turn to that sensation because they think they're going to be fed. They think something like a nipple's over there and it's feeding time. So we'll watch little videos of each of these in between. Let's get forward to rooting here. So they stroke the baby's cheek. This baby's kind of resistant to it, but it will turn its head and open its mouth. Maybe not perfectly, but it will do it. So this baby's a little quicker at it. If you just stroke, it turns its face and it wants to get it in its mouth, right? So this is a natural response because that's how babies get fed. Other reflexes include sucking. So if you've ever been around a newborn, the second you have a finger in their mouth or something, they automatically suck on it instinctively. And then we have the Moro reflex, which is where if you pretend to drop a baby or you make it feel like they're falling real fast. If you're holding a baby like this and you go down real quick, they will feel like they're falling. And one of their reflexes is they stick out their arms and their legs in this really jostled manner. And the Science of Babies will talk about how they think that it has something to do with our like evolution. And, you know, apes, when they're falling, they stick out their arms and legs trying to grab onto branches or leaves or something to grab onto so they don't fall. So maybe that's why we go like this, so our space is bigger and we can attempt to grab onto things, even though newborn babies really can't do that. So this is the Moro reflex. They pretend to drop this baby and its arms and legs fly out in an attempt to maybe catch itself. Anytime a baby feels like they lose balance, they do this. Maybe searching for something to hang on to, maybe making themselves bigger, who knows. But all newborns will do this. So then we go back to, whoops, I'm all over the place, sorry. We have a grasping reflex too. So babies' hands and feet will instinctively grasp at things. So if you touch the palm of a baby's hand, their fingers will go around it. If you touch the palm of their foot, their little toes will curl around it as well.
5 to 6 months of age, when plantar disappears.
So let's fast forward here. They're stimulating the palm and the fingers grasp around it really quickly. Same with the feet, right? So all of these are natural, but at a certain point they will stop, right? So my 4-year-old, if I put my finger into him, he doesn't have the instinctive thing to grasp. He does it because he's trying to rip off my finger, but he doesn't do it as an instinctive thing. So even these babies can grab really hard. They just do it on impulse, right? These are all innate reactions. They're reflexes. They're not choosing to do this. It's just their bodies naturally respond this way. And then we have the Babinski reflex, which is where if you stroke up the side of their foot, their toes flare out instead of going in. So for adults, if we would do it, we would expect their toes to go inward. Babies should flare outward. And so they use this to test for like neurological issues and stuff in development. So that's what it's helpful for. So how much do babies learn from us modeling? As far as these pictures go, when my kid was little, it looks like he's modeling some inappropriate behavior that maybe I would sometimes do to others. Thing is, I don't do it in front of him. And this little, they're not going to be able to pick up on that stuff. So these are funny little accidents because it's hilarious to see babies doing stuff like this. But it's completely accidental. As they get older, though, they do start to model and mimic, you know, naughty words, naughty behaviors, or just any behavior, right? Like that's how they learn to do most of their stuff is observational learning. Another thing we see is the cephalocaudal trend, this head to foot direction of development. So babies first get control of their necks and then they start figuring out their arms a lot and their feet. So like army crawling is a really good example of how this cephalocaudal trend takes place. Like my kid, he was an army crawler. He would just crawl around using his arms and dragging the rest of his body behind him because, you know, his legs were there, but he hadn't really figured out how to use them as well as his arms. So because I'm a psych teacher and I like to try stuff on my kid all the time and videotape, be like, oh, this is how the psych principle fits. This is that cephalocaudal trend where he could have easily used his legs to repel him, but instead he just used his arms to drag his body all the time. He was never very good at the legs for quite some time, and he would just army crawl everywhere all the time because he hadn't quite figured out how to use the rest of his body. So there's a better one.
Good job, buddy.
So development is tough. And while we have this head down cephalocaudal, we have this proximedistal trend where coordination goes from the core out. So a lot of babies, when they're trying to reach stuff, they won't turn their body, or they're not going to use their arms. They'll turn their whole and complete body to get this, because they control the whole thing more rather than the fine motor skills.